can you speak up for yourself more? And how can you do that in therapy as well? Today, I'm going to share some of my own experiences with, um, I guess, with being authentic and learning how to communicate directly and give people feedback, both in therapy and outside of it. So, I just wanted to start by saying that, you know, some people find it very hard to give feedback. And they feel as if, like, if they provide, like, what isn't working, like, if they tell someone, hey, I didn't like this, or, this didn't help me, that is hurtful, right? And that they're going to take care of somebody else's feelings by just keeping that inside. But what happens is when we don't express like, what we're experiencing with somebody else, the relationship does not benefit from that. Often we end up having like some kind of resentment, or we become passive aggressive, or it just like comes out sideways, or it just comes out all at once in like one big volcano explosion. A lot of times, I think behind anger, there is this feeling of stuckness that can be fed by not speaking up for ourselves. So I'm going to share a little bit about how we can speak up for ourselves and how we can also do this in therapy. I think it's really hard sometimes because sometimes we feel loyal and we're not even aware of it. It's like this unconscious loyalty. And we see this within families, but also within workplaces or schools, other systems, where you feel like if you were to speak up, it would not be appreciated. And if you were to set yourself apart by having a different perspective or having a different value, um, that it would be unacceptable, right? And that you could actually get kicked out of the system, or, be uh, criticized or have some other kind of unpleasant consequence. Well, it can be hard then to see when it is safe to speak up and assert ourselves. So I just wanted to kind of validate that, because sometimes it's a survival strategy, like we've learned to not speak up for ourselves. And maybe it's because no one respected when we did, which is really unfortunate, right? Like if we grew up where people didn't really care what our boundaries were or what our values were. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Um, Part of my own like recovery journey and also like skill development as a therapist has been, how do you do this? Right? How can we give people feedback? And I just wanted to start by saying, see it as feedback. I think when we want to talk to someone about something difficult, if we think about it as like a personal issue, like this is who this person is, this is who I am, and like it's about our value as people, then it's probably not going to be as successful as if we externalize the issue, meaning it's no longer about their value as a person or my value as a person. It is now about how we are interacting, how we're communicating. Um, do you see the difference there? There is definitely a difference, but it can take a little bit to think about it. But it's basically like, I'll give you an example. Let's say two people are, living together. This could be like a roommate or a partner situation, friend situation. Say they're living together and the one person gets really upset because the other person keeps leaving dirty dishes in the sink. And so the person who's upset about their dirty dishes says to the other person, "You're just a slob. Like, clearly you do not care about the fact that there's dirty dishes in the sink, meaning that you must not care about cleanliness. Or maybe you don't care about me because then I have to clean the dishes." So you see all of the assumptions that are being made, right? The assumption of like, if the person cares about cleanliness, if the person cares about, you, versus I'll show a different way of it, of like handling that versus saying something like, "Hey, I notice that you've been leaving dishes in the sink. I really care about having no dishes in the sink, and I end up cleaning the dishes. I choose to do that, and I'm realizing now that it is actually upsetting me when you leave the dishes in the sink. Can you share with me a little bit about your process and, what's behind it?" And even saying something like, "I care about our relationship. I enjoy living with you. I've noticed that we have this dynamic where I do the dishes and then you leave more in the sink. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because it's not working for me. I'd like to change it. And then asking too, I'm open to whatever feedback you have for me, but can we address one topic at a time, so we don't get kind of carried away? So that's just one example, right? If we make it, and also we join with the person so that it's us working together against the challenge, that can be very helpful. Um, okay, so that is one way of giving feedback is you're saying the I statement. Like have noticed, right? When we lead with like you, that can be very like it can feel very overwhelming to someone. So it is better to kind of state our own experience and also be really open-minded to what the other person is seeing about the situation, because we can have very different perspectives. Our brains are not always rational. We come to all kinds of judgments and conclusions just based off of what we see and our own life experiences. So, in general, I found it's really important to try to like identify what my judgments are. So, to not completely ignore them, pay attention to it, identify what it is, and then try to set it aside and be um, open to what the person's going to share. Okay. Another area where we can give feedback, or really assert ourselves is just around our values. Um, if we have grown up in, a household or an environment where, we couldn't be separate or different, it's possible that we've just inherited the values of that system. And we haven't really had the time or the freedom to explore what is important to us. And there are some really great things out there like values card sorts and values activities where you can kind of look at different values. I also like to see, what is important to you and maybe what was important to you as a kid, and what do you remember very early on valuing and enjoying. And it could be something like play or art or you know, nature. It could be something like that, where when you grow up, you're kind of like diverted away for whatever reason. Um, maybe you were steered towards those values that aligned with yours, but a lot of times I do hear from people that, they were kind of handed some values and told this is what's right. So part of being an adult and going to therapy and working on ourselves can mean looking at what values do we want to reclaim, and that also can involve maybe learning how to speak up for ourselves in certain situations, such as when our boundaries aren't aligning with our values. So I'll give you an example of this. Sometimes if we have been with people who don't hold the same boundaries, we are not really comfortable with like defining different boundaries for ourselves, such as like around, personal space or comments about our appearance, or could be really anything. But I'll give you an example of how to do this. So if you notice that someone is repeatedly violating a boundary you have, such as calling you in the middle of the night. Okay, let's say someone calls you in the middle of the night all the time and it wakes you up. You have a couple options, right? One, we can like turn off our ringer so we don't actually wake up. But two, we can talk with them and say like, hey, I've noticed that when you call me in the middle of the night, like it wakes me up. I would appreciate it if you did not do it. And then you can always do like more firm if it continues to such a thing as like, hey, I have to leave my ringer on because of my work. And so therefore, when you call me at night, like it does wake me up, I'm going to need to block your number if you continue to do it, because sleep is really important to me. So that's an example, just kind of an arbitrary one. But you see how it's about me, like I'm making it about me, and I'm not saying like you. It's just about like what I need. And someone can either choose to do it or not, right? Um, but I'm kind of sharing my boundary and then just kind of gently coming back to it and trying to not do it with a lot of emotion. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time before we can set a boundary. Like we have to allow ourselves to process through the emotion first so that we're not coming at it with like a lot of anger or frustration, because people respond to that. If we come at them with all this anger and frustration over them violating a boundary that maybe they didn't know we had, maybe they didn't recognize it because they don't know how to recognize boundaries of other people, or maybe they just simply can't read your mind and they don't know that it bothers you. Um, if we come at them with this like heightened emotion, they might be more likely to have like a very defensive response. So I've found that it helps for me to first work through my own feelings about it and then practice what I want to say. And it's always helpful to talk to a friend or someone else about it to see if the approach sounds good. Because sometimes things sound better in our head versus when we actually write it out on a piece of paper or say it to another person. Okay, so then I wanted to also share about how in therapy, success can be so dependent on being able to exchange feedback. And this goes both like as a client in therapy and a therapist working in therapy. And I'm just going to speak for myself here and say that when I went to therapy, especially when I was much younger, I felt like I needed to do a good job by having therapy work. And I also felt like I couldn't be fully honest because the therapist wouldn't be able to handle it. And also because I didn't want to like hurt their feelings. And I also kind of felt like they were my parents or something. You know, the age difference was impactful for me. Now, looking back on that, I think it would have been very, very helpful if I could have told those therapists, like, hey, our age difference is impacting me. I noticed that I feel like you're my parents and I can't tell you everything because I'm a teenager and teenagers keep secrets from their parents, right? Or whatever it is, because just being able to talk about the dynamic is so important because that's how we can talk about transference and countertransference, which is the relationship between the therapist and the client. And just being able to talk about it can really help shift the dynamic quite a lot. And it takes a lot of the power out of things once we put words to them. So that's something that I noticed. Also, there was a time when I worked with a therapist of a certain demographic, and I felt like I had to really perform for them. Like I had to really just kind of like be like a good student. And it just put me in this student mode. And I didn't really share my misgivings or my fears or my doubts or like how at that time I was not doing well. And I did not share the extent to which I was not doing well with my therapist. And that was not helpful for me. And I don't think they benefited either because like they don't benefit from me acting like I'm doing well when I'm really not. And so something I learned from that experience is how important it is to work with someone who we feel like we can be vulnerable with. And if we feel like we can't be vulnerable, like I think it's important to feel like you can even say that, right? Because our feedback might be helpful. And even if it's not helpful to them, like the experience of us giving it can be very empowering because ideally therapy should be a safe space where we can give feedback. And something that I probably could have said would be something like, you know, I realize that I feel the need to perform in here and to act like I'm doing better than I am. You know, we're doing all of these steps. I'm taking all these actions with you in therapy, but I'm actually getting worse. Or I feel like we're not getting to like the true issue. Like I'm giving you other issues that I feel like we can work on, and I'm holding back like the really important like rawness that actually does need to be paid attention to. Of course, this is in retrospect, right? Everything looks different in hindsight, but I have found that in general, um, being able to exchange feedback with someone is really important for therapy success or for people meeting their goals, right? And when I did work with a therapist where I felt like I could be just brutally honest with about my own experience, and I'm not saying being mean or rude, but just honest and vulnerable. And it's all about like the way that I've like to frame this is to say something like, I'm experiencing this, this, and this, right? Because it's about what I'm experiencing. I don't know who this person is really, right? I just know how I'm experiencing them. And it's also less threatening to people when you frame things in terms of your own experience or the dynamic. because it doesn't come off as an attack. And so generally, I see better results when I frame things in terms of what I'm noticing. And there's more potential for healing and growth because the therapeutic relationship can be seen as a practice relationship for all the other ones in our life, right? And often it can be really hard to give people feedback and to accept their feedback, especially like from a partner or a close friend or a family member. So therapy can be a way to practice that process. And being able to receive feedback from my therapist in the past was very helpful for me. And it showed me like how to work through, okay, when someone gives me feedback, I immediately take it as like a very big criticism or like I'm not good enough. Wow, that's interesting. That tells me something important about myself, and to really work through that um, instead of just avoid it, right? Or just internalize it and stuff it down and be like, oh God, I don't want any more feedback ever. I have found that feedback can be so important, and I have only grown from getting feedback. Even the feedback you don't want to get, um, sometimes there can be a kernel of truth in there. And I've noticed that when I have a defensive reaction to feedback, it's very helpful for me to just keep my mouth closed, thank them for the feedback about, and then think about it and really sit on it and allow myself to process it. Because often there is something that I can take away from that experience. And yeah, so that's some from me about feedback. None of this is really intended to be therapeutic advice because it's not individualized to you. But I hope that there is something that you can take away from it. If this was helpful to you, please like and share or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening.